Hello guys and welcome back. If you're new here, welcome aboard, Captain. So the purpose of this video is due to the fact that I see more and more pilots on Vatsim not completely knowing how to fly on there. And after years I have finally reached my breaking point, so to speak. So in a minute you'll learn stuff that I bet you probably did not know before. If you don't have a clue about some of these things, then I will leave a link down below so you can go ahead and learn them. This video is not meant as a full Vatsim tutorial, but merely as a cherry on top. It is aimed at every pilot, but I think the newbie pilots will benefit the most. So, without further ado, let's get started. Starting off with tip number 1. Before you get started on a flight, make sure you do a microphone check. And I'm not talking about a radio check here, but rather go into your pilot client audio options and making sure that your microphone output volume is within the green band and not a single decimal higher than that. I've experienced way too many times where I almost had to throw my headset off due to the excessive output volume. The good thing about this is that you won't need a radio check from a controller because the green band told you all the things you need to know. Smart, right? Tip number 2, and I can't believe I have to say this, but know how to fly your aircraft. Not only how to fly it physically, but know how to operate the systems and the FMC, etc. This is crucial during unforeseen events like go-arounds. Tip number 3. If you're brand new on the Vatsim network, then way to go. You've already come a long way then. For complete newbies, I have a few pieces of advice here. First, being to choose a call sign you're going to stick with for some time. I did that when I first started flying on Vatsim, because I felt a little more confident that I knew my call sign inside out. Second piece of advice is to choose a route, airport or airline that you're going to stick with for some time too. That way you can really get used to the phraseology used on Vatsim and you won't have too much on your plate since you fly the same route or to the same airport with the same airline. And when you're confident enough, you can always step up from there. Tip number 4. When flying on Vatsim, there are certain procedures that you must know how to do. The following are supplementary procedures only, and if you want to learn them all, I suggest you go to the Vatsim website for more info. But with that said, if you cannot do either one of these procedures I'm mentioning, then I would suggest learning them as soon as possible. Otherwise, you might going to frustrate the controllers and pilots around you. To start off, you must be able to fly direct to a certain waypoint, even though the waypoint is not in your flight plan. You must be able to reach a certain waypoint at a certain altitude or speed. The instruction will probably sound like this: Ryanair 45 Echo Lima when ready, descend to reach flight level 250 at Dibble. You must know what a radial is, as well as to be able to fly a radial. Just to briefly touch on that, a VOR is a station that emits beams or radials out on all 360 degrees. When you fly a radial, you will fly on one of these degrees coming from the VOR station. To demonstrate why this may be necessary, let's say I'm departing out of Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands. All runways there have a departure towards the west, except for one runway, runway 36 center. Why that is, I'm not sure, but if you want to fly towards the west for departure, you must fly a certain radial from Sierra Papa Lima VOR, given that the runway doesn't have any departures towards the west. You must be able to execute a holding pattern overhead a published waypoint or a custom waypoint, as well as what hold as published means. You must know how to fly a certain Mach number and speed. You must obey the initial climb altitude and know how to find it out. You must know how to vacate the runway at a particular taxiway as per ATC instruction. You must know how to squawk ident as well as to squawk mode Charlie. You must know how to check if there's relevant ATC online. You must know the phonetic alphabet. You must know when to transmit on a frequency in order not to interrupt an unfinished exchange between pilot and ATC. You must squawk 2000 for IFR and 7000 for VFR if no transponder code has been assigned by ATC or if there's no relevant ATC online. Also, a good thing to know is that reading back all the weather information when given a METAR by ATC is simply a waste of time. The only weather-related information that requires a readback is the altimeter setting, and most importantly, ask the controller to repeat if you didn't understand his instruction. Tip number 5. Learn how to do FMC/MCDU shortcuts. This includes creating custom waypoints and DME arcs. For context, I was once flying into Atlanta and I was given an instruction saying, Southwest 1863, clear direct Atlanta, cross 15 miles from Atlanta at or below 15,000. So in this case I had to create a custom waypoint based on the information given by the last instruction. Learning how to program these things are of course optional, but they can be a huge help in certain situations and can alleviate your workload drastically. If you want to learn these things, there's a link for Boeing FMC and Airbus MCDU shortcuts down below. Tip number 6. When planning a flight, then plan responsibly. PFPX or SimBrief does not do all the work for you. Go to the relevant Vatsim website for the respective country and find out the departure/arrival procedures and read the briefing package for each airport if available. They are published for the pilots, so you might as well read it. There is no excuse not to do it. Also, check out the appropriate ATIS, if available, during the flight planning. That makes the process so much easier because the information is already in the flight plan. Tip number 7. Disregard the runways that PFPX or SimBrief have given you, at least just momentarily. They might have an idea of what runway could be in use, but it is far from accurate. To find this out, I would suggest going to the relevant Vatsim website and see if they have real-world information about the runway in use, or simply use Flight Radar 24. When you're planning a flight and in doubt about runway usages, then do this in the following order. First, check the ATIS information at the airport. If there's no ATIS information available, then check out Flight Radar 24, which tracks live real-world movements. Controllers on Vatsim implement procedures based on the real world, though some controllers on Vatsim have their own procedures, which is why you should always check the ATIS first. If you're not in range of the airport yet, then check out useful apps like Vatastic, Volanta, VatGlasses, or VatSpy to find out the ATIS information from there. Tip number 8. Just because there's no wind doesn't mean you can choose every runway you want. I'm really getting tired of seeing uncaring pilots on UNICOM choosing their own runway like it's a f***ing all-you-can-eat buffet. There's still a system to be followed, even though there's no controllers present. And yeah, sure, if you're inbound to a dead airport and to no complications for other pilots, then yes, I'd say it's allowed. If you cannot respect that simple rule, then go offline. If in doubt about choosing runways, go back to tip number 7. Tip number 9. Don't be afraid to contact other pilots. When the controllers are offline, it's the pilot's responsibility to sequence themselves properly, and that cannot be done without proper communications with other pilots. So I urge the pilots that are inbound on a conflicting heading to either use the voice feature or open up a private chat to stay clear of traffic. To open up a private chat, simply type in the vpilot chatbox.msg space callsign space your message. If you want to discuss non-related topics, then open up a private chat. Other pilots really don't want to hear about it. Also nice to know is when you're in the descent phase and you want to state which star you're going to take and perhaps an ETA, then I'd recommend using the text feature because there's a high chance that other pilots won't be able to hear anything but static noise due to the greater distance between you. Tip number 10. When flying west, you must choose an even flight level, and when you're flying east, you must choose an odd flight level. You already knew that, that's nice. But here's the twist that you might not know. Some countries, instead of focusing on traffic going west and east, they actually focus on traffic going north and south. This means you should cruise at an even flight level when flying north, and an odd flight level when flying south. The countries I know that implement this procedure is Italy, France, Portugal, and Spain. Please note that if you're flying either in or out of these countries I just mentioned, then you must compensate accordingly to this rule. Tip number 11. When flying on UNICOM, you do not need to check in or obtain clearances or requesting taxi or stating that you will leave/enter the cockpit, etc. No one cares when you're cruising. The only time you should state anything on UNICOM is on the ground and during arrival and departure, and also when you encounter conflicting traffic on cruise. If there's any safety concerns or hazard to you or others, you ask the other pilots for their intention. End of story. Tip number 12. I'm sure you've all been flying into busy airports at some point in your Vatsim career. During busy hours, you will sometimes be told to monitor a frequency, or stand by on a frequency. This means you should switch to that frequency and wait until a controller calls you up. Contact and monitor a frequency does not mean the same thing. Be aware. Tip number 13. It's not always ATC tells you to grab the runway holding point at the end. Sometimes they may instruct you to grab a runway intersection, so make sure you plan for multiple runway entries in your takeoff calculations. During events and busy hours, this is absolutely key because you have so little time if you get a last minute runway holding point change. And you don't want to be like, yeah, stand by, I need a minute to redo the takeoff calculations when ATC needs you to move the most. Remember, preparation is key. Tip number 14. Speaking of busy hours, or just regular hours, don't underestimate the power of a good briefing. I know the majority skips the briefing, but to be frank, the briefing is a non-negotiable item in the real world, and since we're trying to mimic the real world as closely as possible, which I guess is the idea of flight simming, at least for me, you should do them too. I would put emphasis on the taxi part as well as the go-around part. Some airports have dedicated briefing packages for you. Those are available on each respective country's Vatsim website. Just Google Vatsim Belgium, for instance. Just like the pilots in the real world would say, it should almost be as if you visited the airport before, just in your mind. Tip number 15. When obtaining the IFA clearance, try to have jotted down as much information as you can beforehand. That way, IFA clearances will be much easier to understand. This applies to arrival and approach clearances too. Just write down all the possible combinations, and when finally being given the clearance, all you have to do is put a circle around the arrival that is already on there. Regarding IFR clearances, when I first started flying on Vatsim, I used the craft method to pick up IFR clearances. This method can be used all over the world. First, start off by listing the word craft vertically on a notepad. The C means clear to your respective destination. The R means the standard instrument departure route you're going to fly, this including the transition, if you get one. The A means the initial altitude you're being cleared to. Note, if the initial climb altitude is higher than the transition altitude, this will be given in flat level instead of altitude. The F is for frequency. You will most likely only get frequency if you're flying in the US, for instance, but if you're flying elsewhere, you can manually fill that section out, which will become handy when you're departing out of an airport with an auto handoff procedure. Finally, T is for transponder. This is where you'll put in your squawk code. In my experience, by using this procedure, picking up IFR clearances is no problem at all. It'll even be easier to read back a clearance if we already have written down this stuff in advance. Tip number 16. Some controllers don't give you the ICAO code for VOR stations. Instead, they give you the full name of the VOR station. For foreign pilots, this can be a little tricky to understand. Therefore, it's always good to know the full name of a VOR station, especially when your standard instrument departure is named after a VOR. For instance, the VOR Dinkelspiel, Delta Kilo Bravo, when departing out of Nuremberg. Tip number 17. When you're descending, you might heard the term on conversion as a part of an instruction before. It will sound something like this. Speedbird 73 Lima, descend flight level 100, on conversion speed 260 knots. So, when planes operate at higher altitudes, the reference speed will no longer be indicated airspeed, but Mach. Long story short, when a plane descends there comes a point where Mach becomes useless and where indicated airspeed becomes relevant again, as well as when a plane climbs, there comes a point where indicated airspeed becomes useless and where Mach becomes relevant. The term on conversion, the majority of the times, means that the aircraft descends through the point at which it starts using indicated airspeed again. So when ATC says speedbird 73 lever, descend flight level 100, on conversion speed 260 knots, it means you should do 260 knots indicated when able. Tip number 18. Let's go over the basic definition of transition altitude and transition level. So, when you're passing the transition altitude, you should switch over to standard pressure, which is 1013 hectopascals or 2992 inches of mercury. When you're passing the transition level, on the other hand, you should switch over to the local airport pressure. If I put the two words up here, you can remember them like this. The A in the transition altitude looks like an upwards arrow. The V in transition level looks like a downwards arrow, meaning transition altitude is used during climb and transition level is used during descent. Sometimes it happens that you get a flat level in your initial climb clearance. This means that ATC wants you to fly those 6,000 feet, for example, on standard pressure. This also means that you will pass your transition altitude before those 6,000 feet. Tip number 19. Learn how to use the correct autobrake setting so you can vacate the runway exactly as planned. That will make navigation at the airport so much easier because you know exactly where you vacated the runway. Let me show you a simple way of calculating an autobrake setting. You must have a landing performance calculator on hand in order to do this. First thing, make your way to Google Maps, type in the airport name or ICAO code and go to satellite view. Now we're going to find out what is called the aiming point, which will be identified as the two thick white markers on the runway, as you can see here. Right click just behind the aiming point on the runway centerline and select Measure Distance. Then find your runway or planned runway exit and right click the runway abeam that exit. That will be your landing distance. If you manage to get as closely as possible to that number in your performance calculator, you should be able to vacate the runway perfectly at that taxiway. It may also be a good idea to count the taxiways while rolling down the runway to make sure you get the right taxiway. Actually, Real World Pilots does this as well. Tip number 20. Know the go-around procedure for your respective aircraft as well as the published missed approach procedure. You've just passed the 200 feet call-out, and ATC now suddenly tells you to go around. What is the go-around procedure for your aircraft as described in the flight manual? Make sure to know this. Secondly, let's say you manage to get airborne again from the go-around instruction. Now ATC tells you to fly the missed approach as published, meaning you should fly the missed approach procedure described on the respective approach chart. Make sure you also know this, or at least the first bit of it. Tip number 21. You don't need an active Navigraph subscription to get the latest charts. You can 90% of the times find chart services that are completely free of charge, and there is a few ways you can do it. The first method is to use ChartFox. ChartFox is a free service created to assist flight simulator pilots with finding and using navigation charts for educational purposes. To use ChartFox, go to the ChartFox website and search for the relevant airport using the ICAO code. If the airport isn't there, do this instead. Open up Google and type EAIP and then the country which airport you want to find the charts for is located in. Now several results may pop up, but you generally want to click the link to an airspace control department or an aeronautical information service or something similar. If you made it that far, you now only have to select the AIP amendment date or the airport and boom, there's your free charts. That is what I had for you guys this time. I hope you find some of these things useful. Remember, being a newbie at Vatsim is completely okay. But please have your Vatsim skills polished before putting yourself out there. You'll thank me later. If you like this video, please consider to share it with your buddies if they need to know a thing or two about this video. If you have any questions, you know exactly where to put them. I'll see you guys in the next one.
$50, $40, $30, $20, $10.